So much once again, Craig, for joining today. This is going to be so sick. Your work, man, is absolutely wild and something that within the last couple of years I've been introduced to. And first and foremost, I wanted to say thank you for taking the time today. This is awesome, man.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So, within your work, kind of initially digging back into earlier interests, a lot of times we do these types of things, but I, am more interested into hearing, if I were to close my eyes and imagine, the sights and sounds of a local bookstore, local library, the place that early on, really made an impression. What comes to mind to you as far as these special places?
Yeah, sort of where the passion took root or the obsession took root.
Sure.
I'm Canadian, so we've lived all over the place, sort of on my own. My parents moved around a lot, so I remember one place that probably was really memorable to me. We lived out in Calgary, and there's a Fish Creek. It's called the Fish Creek Library, and it's like this really brutalist looking architecture. It's like a pyramid almost, but kind of a lopsided. But you've got these giant panes of glass that slant light through to the as like maybe a 3-story structure. And I remember, my mom would be doing something of a Saturday or Sunday, and she just dropped me and my brother off, and we'd have, whatever. As long as she was doing her stuff, we had sort of to roam around the library. Um, and I mean, it's very different. I've worked at a library in my 20s, and even by then, it was different from the library that I remember growing up. Like I remember, and I know I can tell I'm older than you, but like we would have you would thread dowel like newspapers onto like long wooden dowels, and you'd sort of hang them on these hangers. So the generally like the older guys would come by and spend their mornings sort of reading the newspapers and sort of sharing the sections with one another.
Okay.
And as I worked at a library, it was I was the dowel threader, and patching up all the sort of magazines that the kids, like video game magazines that the kids would rip to shreds. For me, one thing that seemed to me, as many libraries as I visited, and I'm not sure about you, Eric, how much every bookstore sort of seems to, other than like a corporate bookstore, has its own sort of tenor and texture. Obviously, libraries the same way, but I found like the chairs, they had like a smell that was unique to library chairs, and it
Yeah.
was sort of
Okay.
a miasma of like everybody who'd sat in it, and whatever, and they're not supposed to be eating, but you know what I mean? Whatever you can remember, and it's almost an impossible sort of scent to describe, but if someone distilled it and, put it in an aerosol spray and sprayed it in my room, I'd be like, "Oh my god, that's library chairs." You know? So
Love that.
I remember one thing when I was working at a library, one of the big things was trying to encourage youth to, get a library card, come to the library. A lot of it was offering them a couple hours of computer time, which they would spend, doing whatever, but they wouldn't necessarily get a book and go home with it. And, I have 2 young children myself, and sadly, other than sort of doing story times as when they were really young, go there, we have not use the library in the way that I used to as I was a kid, and that is a
Mm,
shame, And they're good readers, they're avid readers, but they don't necessarily get books out of libraries or spend an afternoon there like I used to. So it was hugely fundamental to my sense of becoming a reader, and then
sure.
ultimately graduating to being a writer.
Yeah. I mean, was there anything in those earlier memories of you looking back and just thinking of yourself, maybe on a couple occasions being that young little bastard that you're like, man, why did I do that? Now that I'm working in a library, did any of those things come back to haunt you years later?
Absolutely. You know, yes, the kids were, the kids, I worked in kind of an underprivileged neighborhood. So the kids would come in and, they were actually, usually were, quite good. There were a couple times where, you know, we had to, it's very difficult to try and ask say a 55-year-old man to stop watching pornography in a public library. But
Oh
sometimes
my
that
God.
became unwittingly became part of your job, unexpectedly and unwantedly. So when I remember looking back, I mean, the kids were, you knew when a kid brought a book back because they would shove it through the book slot and it might have like, an orange crush stain all over it. But, uh, But you know, other than that, it was sadly it was the adults who were more of a nuisance and a disturbance than the kids.
Oh man, Jesus, and I appreciate hearing that just out of there just being different times, and I think with your work and kind of having that seeing eyeglass on youth, and just kind of those different things that when you're that young you're not thinking of, or you're not thinking of the repercussions of those things, but
No, no,
yeah.
exactly. And we encourage the kids to come and to use the library and to use it as sort of a spot of communal gathering, and which again, that didn't seem to be the case of when I was a kid. I mean, the library is much used in a more sort of like, come get your books,
Mm.
check them out, spend some time reading if you wanted to. I mean, I used to love doing that, come and I'd pick a book out and I'd read. I mean, I'd start reading it, and if I decided I loved it, then I would take it home with me, and sometimes I would just like tuck it back into the stack.
Mhm.
Sometimes usually, in a place that it didn't belong, so I knew I'd come back the next week and be able to find it. So, so I misshelve it on purpose. So, but I remember sort of in horror, that was back in the 80s, and
Mhm.
that when I mean, it was a really big boom for horror. I think both in film and movie. I mean, King was around in the 70s, but I came to him in the 80s, and so there would be an entire shelf really dedicated to him, and Kuntz and Rice. And Barker was coming on the scene at that point. So I remember just working
Yeah,
my way
sure.
steadily through, um, you know, as many of those books as I could. And as soon as they showed up at the library, if some other, horror kid didn't take them, it would have been me taking them.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, and you touching on that too. You've mentioned, obviously in other interviews and things, but are there, books rather than the obvious, that you've come across that maybe you feel are, underrated, or it's just something that maybe it's not popular with, the vast crowd, but has always been very special to you, Stephen King wise?
Oh, of Stephen King specific, of maybe an undervalued. Geez, it's it's a strange thing with King, because I've kept up with him. It's hard to keep so prolific, you know what I mean? But
Yeah.
I've kept up with them all into the 2000s, and from there I kind of less so, But I'd say a big book like the Kennedy assassination book I would read, and
Oh man.
Mercedes. I mean, like they're all, it's one of those things. It's funny because someone will say, you might see like, oh, well, this King book sucks. Someone might say that, but and then you'd look and you'd realize they'd read like most of King's stuff. So really, they're kind of judging King against himself.
Sure.
So like, I mean, you could say Tommyknockers of the King oeuvre is sort of not one of his best. He would
Hmm.
probably be the same, but Tommyknockers just as a book compared to any other horror writer writing that book, that would probably be the best book they ever wrote.
Totally. Yeah.
King, it's sort of, he was down the cocaine highway at that point. So, but still, even maybe potentially coked out of his mind. That is still, you go back to it. It's still a wonderful book in a lot of ways. It just like
Sure.
compared to his best. Okay, yeah, it doesn't measure up, but in terms of like, you know, it's hard to say a book of his that I feel like is not, even something like Dreamcatcher. Again, I think people would
Oh yeah.
say that that's not, but that does a lot of stuff that King is excellent at. The interiority. He has an entire section where one of the characters sort of sets up this like mental barricade for himself, sort of against the predation of the alien that's trying to like not only take over his body, but take over his brain, specifically take over like the sort of his psyche. And there's just so much about King's work and ability, and the way that he sort of is sort of, you, I don't know how to say the word, sui generis. Like he's of his own type, he's of his own kind,
Mhm.
um, and sort of saturated and influenced the genre and other genres in such a way that it's almost impossible to separate it out at this point.
Yeah.
In terms of, yeah, one that I feel like is undervalued. That'd be tough to say. I mean, do you have one? Is there one that you think, oh, or even a horror book, that you feel that this one doesn't get the shine that maybe it properly deserves.
Honestly, I love like any of the stuff that's prolific. He has the career that he has because of, the stuff that he puts out. Recently, one that really made a huge jump on me was Joyland. Have you heard of that, or have you read
Oh, I
that
love
one?
Berlin. Yeah,
Oh
yeah, yeah.
man, I thought it was so and once again, I mean, him at his best as far as, and I can even credit, you as well, with the character build and, just the kind of feel that you get in the relationship that's going on, the moments of complete unsettlement. That book was awesome. I absolutely loved it, and it for
Absolutely.
it being something newer.
Well, and I would say he doesn't get credit, but I don't think that's true. I hope he gets the credit now that maybe he wasn't getting in the 80s and 90s, especially as like a chronicler of childhood and teenagehood. And I think Joyland, in my memory, is sort of like it taps into that ability that he has, most maybe obvious in It and Stand By Me or The Body.
Right.
Several of his novels and books deal really poignantly with, outside of sort of, the scary stuff or the, terrifying stuff. He really he seems to be able to remember childhood, his own, or just like this general sense of childhood that
Really
most
tap into it.
lose, right? Like one thing about having kids is you can sort of in a weird refracted way see your own childhood through what they're going through, but you
Yeah.
still can't, like, it's your child isn't a portal back to your own childhood. It's not like number one that way. It doesn't work that way. It's only at best it sort of, you see your son or daughter going through something and it somewhat reminds you of your own passage through it, but he seems to have this kind of, again, almost magical ability to remember childhood in a way that very few writers or people, I think, can.
Sure. Yeah. And not anything as far as, like with being overly personal, but with you kind of touching on that, are there, different things to where like seeing your own kids and seeing those struggles, kind of push into that inspiration of like, oh yeah, okay, like maybe that innocence into something, or looking at something with, complete blind eyes and just the interest of that's a bright color type things, really draw.
Absolutely. I mean, I think certainly I read books differently now as a father. Like, I'll go back to a book that I'd read as a teenager or something, and depending on the book and the narrative, it'll hit me in a completely different way now. A, 'cause
Hmm.
I'm a mother, but B, because I'm a father, and maybe those books dealt with sort of a child and parent relationship in a way that I sort of didn't. It didn't resonate with me. Other parts of the book did. So how much of that you can bring into your own work? I definitely do think my own writing has changed significantly. Partially because you just get older, and I've been doing this for however many years. And if I were, it'd be like meeting, you meet a guy from high school, and he's like, "Oh, you're the exact same guy that you were in high school." That's amazing. You
Yeah.
just want to go and do beer bongs in the back of the pickup truck. Fun for one, but so it's, I think the way that I am changing as a writer, and the way, if you follow the careers of a lot of writers, you will see changes that are indicative to where they are at their place in life. I remember reading like Cold Hard Canyon by Clive Barker, and
Okay.
it's a big book, and probably, and he this might have been a misjudgment, but I could see why he did it. The first 200 pages almost of a 600-page book deal with like the death of the main character's dog. But you could
Sure.
tell that this was something that Clive himself was going through, and ushering this trusted, loved companion, and that sort of, it was like, I realize now as a writer, it's like, yeah, I mean, this is something that has marked you, has made you feel something in a sort of a deep way that you haven't probably felt before, and so of course, naturally, you would sort of pull it into your work. So certainly, I find that being a dad, more and more, the story, even from the conceptive place, where I decide to come up with an idea, or at least where it sort of hits me in the head,
Hmm.
it hits me in a different way and from a different place at this point in my life. And I suppose if I'm writing still when I'm 60, it'll be, it'll have
Evolved.
morphed, and yeah, hopefully not devolved, but yes, transformed in any case to sort of to meet where I'm at my life at that
Sure.
point. Yeah,
Sure.
a
Okay.
good question. Yeah, but you can. I mean, I notice when you read writers for a long time and you follow them throughout their careers, you pick out these subtle differences from like a young Clive Barker
Hmm.
to sort of the Clive Barker who wrote Cold Hard Canyon or Mr. Begone.
Hmm.
It's like,
And it's funny too because earlier on, before I'd had kids or anything, I remember my mother-in-law telling me that she was reading it after she had had my wife, and was mentioning, just kind of talking about reading the book and kind of digging into it and getting to the certain parts with the children. She's like, I just couldn't finish. I'm like, oh, really? Like you can't, separate the two. Until I had children, and then there's been movies, and there's been books, and there's been just different things where I'm like, I can't do it, and I
no,
never thought that it would be so. But there's just like certain lines where it gets to that point. You're like, man, this is a little much.
absolutely. I mean, you know, Pet Cemetery is one that did that for me. I remember reading it as a teenager and
God.
like, why would he do that? What an idiotic thing to do, take his kid back there and bury him, and like what a dumb thing. He deserves it.
Hmm.
But it's like as an adult, you're like, if my God forbid we lost one of our children, it's like, well, what wouldn't I do?
Desperation,
What
man. Yeah.
exactly what terrible straws wouldn't I grasp at in the hope that like my life and the life of my family would go back to some kind of normalcy? So again, yeah, these books hit you different as a cynical 16-year-old versus sort of a grown up with
Yeah.
kids. Yeah.
Now, your interest in horror, may it be that from a library or a video shop. What's like an earlier memory that you have of that dawning on you? And was it intriguing initially? Was it something where you really just kind of wanted to push away?
God, that's a good question. Where does the dark romance begin, right?
Yeah.
And it's probably pulled from several different parts. A lot of it is just your character and your makeup, and that's passed down and picked up through nature as well. But I would say I was always a scared kid. I had a very hyper developed sense, I think, of fear, and not again, not of like I was raised in a really stable home, so it was much more like I was susceptible to things I'd see on TV or movies. And you having kids too, like it's amazing how trivial the thing can seem. Like I took my son to an arcade, and there were a bunch of like old pinball games, and one of them was like The Walking Dead, a pinball game. They'd have all different
Okay.
teams. He wasn't even playing it. A guy like three pinball games down was playing it. But we get out, everything seems fine. We go home, the sun goes down. My son in bed goes, that pinball game scared the shit out of me. He didn't use that exact phraseology, but he said, I was really scared today, Dad. I'm like, well, what? And he really had to like, you're talking that pinball in the game. So it's like, but I still felt like, you know what? That's the way fear works. It's something at the
Awesome.
corner of your eye that catches you and negatively affects you and squirms its way inside. Like, Ghostbusters, for whatever reason, I went to
Okay.
Ghostbusters at a birthday party, and I remember it was like the old woman in the library. The first scene, I'm like, oh my
Oh man.
God, this is not good. And then by the time I got to like the dogs, that took down Rick Moranis, I remember saying to my buddy, like, I put my hands over my eyes, like, tell me when it's over. And of course, he listened to exactly the dogs. It's over. Like, oh no, you jerk. So, but that was petrifying to me, which is a
Yeah.
comedy movie, right? So it was this obsession that was clearly, I assume, anyways, built on this negative fixation at first, and then I really got into it when I was a teenager or even preteen. My parents really fostered reading in our household, but they were really liberal with what I could read. So
Hmm. Hmm.
Stephen King again during the '80s, you couldn't walk down the street without getting pelted in the back of the head with a Stephen King book. I mean, omnipresent, right? And
Sure.
but even at the library, I remember there were these like the elementary school library. There were a few books there that were like, it just would go around like a whisper in the classroom, like this one. And I remember there was one called. It was called. I don't even know. I think this is the term. It was called The Cactus People, and it was like it had photos in like really bad black and white photos, but it was of this village, this town in the desert that got infected somehow, and everybody got turned into cactuses. So it would show, a picture of a woman
Whoa.
sitting at home, and then the next picture would be she'd look a little bit like a cactus, and they just superimposed a cactus over the picture. But then, the next one would just be a full cactus. It's like, oh, no, she turned into a cactus. And there was another one. It was like this truck's high beams were on, and it was just pointing at like these cactus people in the middle of the night, you know, and it was just, we all passed that around, and I think it scared the hell out of all of us, right? And so
Oh
it's like
man.
that. There's something about horror, I think, of all the genres that's daring, that's there's a subterfuge to it. There's something about it that's like, you shouldn't touch this. This is the dangerous sauce. You certainly
Mhm.
shouldn't eat it, and you shouldn't
Yeah.
look at it directly. But that's the intrigue of it, right? So I think for all those things and many more, and then of course, you know, you mentioned videos. I mean, I was a kid of the '80s and early '90s, so like video stores were great, and you just needed to find that one indulgent video store clerk who would look the other way when you came up with a copy of Hellraiser, and you enjoy it, you know? If he wasn't there, you'd have to leave because you knew you weren't gonna get the video that you wanted, but if he was there, you go up with, like, 3 videos, and, you know, as rough as you could get them. And, you know, we did, me and my buddies. So that was it too. It's the genre of, I mean, listen, it's the genre, as you know, of, like, really great writing too, and really great storytelling, and really subtle horror often, but it's
Mhm.
also the genre of, like, really outre, sort of off the beaten path. You know, how far down the rabbit hole do you want to go? And certainly as a teenager, I went as deeply down that rabbit hole as possible, which is funny because sometimes my own work, I think, fairly gets talked about for um, how grotesque it is, or you know, I suppose for like mass market published books, how far they can sometimes go.
Sure.
But for me, it's all about like thresholds, right? So for me, it doesn't feel like those books are boundary testing at all, because you know the books that I read growing up were way in excess of anything written. So when I hear that, you know, this book is rough or that book is rough, I'm like, I get it compared to a Victorian Gothic ghost story, but
Sure.
compared to where I'm coming from, and sort of the touchstones that I grew up reading and watching, they're, you know, they're not that bad.
Yeah. This is just a spicy mustard. Let me show
Yeah.
you some of the hot sauce that's there.
Exactly. Yeah, the Scoville units on this are no. I've been way up here to Reaper.
No, and that's by no means, you know, like a slide, you know, towards your stuff whatsoever, because I mean, and we will get into this, you know, in further in, you know, but especially being introduced to the troop, some of the moments in that, and all of the years that I've been into horror, and you know, growing up with buddies, kind of like you've mentioned, who have tested my limits and pushed me into the faces of death, and all, you know, just different videos online, that it's like, I don't even want to be here right now. I don't know why I'm sitting through this shit.
Yeah,
Um, Now, as far as in an interview before, you had mentioned a pact, you know, so to speak, between an author and a reader within the horror genre. And, you know, on one hand, there being, you know, that the author won and they scared the shit out of you. On the other hand, you win and it just didn't do the job. Can you give us an example of each? And when you won, were you let down by, you know, all these people building up the book and you were just like, oh, this wasn't bad?
yeah. I'm trying to, you know, I feel like I remember that interview, and you know, I used the word pact, and that's probably, you know, it's like a promise, really. The you know, the author sort of promises, or again, I suppose once a book gets out there, it's like the groundswell of critique and commentary promises that this author is going to do this. You know, they're going to blow your hair back in this way or the other, or introduce you to something unspeakable, or unseat you in a way that
Mhm.
you've never been unseated before. And that's a hard trick to pull off, you know, especially, you know, for you, Eric, and for me. Like, to me, it's like I I want an author to win. You know what I mean? Like, because I am, it's so rare now
Mhm.
for me, because you I think once you write horror, or I guess direct horror or whatever, once you're, or just consume a ton of it, you sort of, you see where things are going before they get there. You're like, okay, this is great, but it's resonant of this. You know, it's almost like you're a mechanic who's learned how to take apart an engine, and that, now you know the engine pretty well. You know the fundamental parts of it, and you can see the way that other creators are building their own engines. And while you admire that, it's sort of like you're too far inside the machine to really be affected by it too much. So,
Sure.
like, for me, it's like, I don't know about you, Eric, but like, I don't know, remember the last movie or book that really Like, what is the last one for you? I mean, I'd say the last one for me is Hereditary. I remember watching Hereditary and
Oh man.
feeling really, and to a lesser extent, Midsummer, but Ari Aster, even some of his sort of student films, there's
Hmm.
something about the way that guy does horror that is really unsettling to me. And before that, I probably have to go back to The Ring. Like, that's the
Oh
gulf
yeah.
between, and that's because I'd never really been exposed to J horror properly until The Ring. Obviously, it was well around. I just hadn't, put my finger on the pulse of it. But and going back further, Jaws, The Exorcist, there's plenty back in my youth. But like, I don't know about you. What's the last one that really sort of unseated you?
I mean, you mentioned Hereditary, and that movie had come out, and the issue I had with it was I was seeing, you know how you like see different ads on maybe social media or even websites. You're looking through articles, and it says the top 10 horror movies of all time, and I was constantly seeing or top 20 or whatever, but I was constantly seeing Hereditary,
Mm,
and that was it was a put off to me because I'm like, this movie's brand new. There's
yeah.
no way. I can't imagine it being as bad as it everybody says. I'd had different friends that said it was great. I had gotten it for Christmas, and it took me basically like 2 days, 2 or 3 days to kind of like finish and get through because it was heavy, very heavy,
It
and
is
I
heavy.
absolutely loved it.
Yeah. Well, one thing but during the pandemic, you're just finding ways to kind of amuse yourself. And one of my buddies said, let's do like a horror movie draft. And in the way that you
Okay.
do a fantasy basketball draft. So, everybody gets
Okay.
together on Zoom and we each,
Awesome.
were given we had like 7 or 8 rounds. And, I led off. I got lucky. I got first pick. It was The Exorcist with a bullet for me. But like, it was amazing going through those. Someone would put like, say Rosemary's Baby as their topic, like number 6. And I like Rosemary's Baby, but it's amazing the polarization that it incurred. And it's often because, again, like with horror, if something hits you, like, you know, claustrophobia, for example,
Hmm.
that can be done really well, like The Descent, or others, but if you're like a cave miner, you know what I mean? It's not going to work for you because it's just like that does not hit my fear trigger. That's just not something that does it for me,
Yeah,
or
sure.
bugs and someone's an entomologist, they're going to be like, nah, bugs are my jam. That just doesn't work for me. So I was amazed how once you got by the top, you know, I don't know, the top sort of 5 or 6, which we could have probably all agreed almost. There were no dissension. But once you got into the further rounds, that's where it's fun because people would bring up a movie they never heard of it. And it's like, oh, I got to check it out. I did, and I'm like, thank God, I'm glad we did this. But there were some that were like the person almost overvalued it, but they didn't. It was just because in their own the way they come to that movie, the way they met themselves at that movie, it really did their head in. Whereas
Oh,
other
sure.
people come to it at a different time in their life or from a different set of collective life circumstances. It's just like like the Babadook, for example. That was one years ago, and I really liked the Babadook, but I don't think she was. I don't, and I've watched some of her other stuff, which I've always really liked, but I don't think she's really into scaring the pants off you. I think she's more into looking at sort of
Psychological. Yeah. Yeah.
and she really, really does a fantastic job of that. But if you're going to go with, if your sense is, I want to get the living daylight scared out of me, then you're going to be let down by that movie, or at least some reviewers will, because it's almost like, well, she's saying that's not the promise I made you. That's not what I was trying to
Yeah.
do.
Yeah.
It's almost your fault, sadly, for coming to it with this expectation that I never, willingly fostered in you.
Yeah. And that was one of those things too. I would probably have to still give it some years to go back and revisit, but the the creature design and the thing that they were showing as the Babadook, when I was going into that, I was 1,000,000% invested. And just in the fact of thinking that it was going to be some sort of entity or some physical thing that was actually like manifesting. And then it just being kind of the outcome, it really, really bummed me out. Not that it was bad, but just when
No,
that
not at
that
all.
realization came to, I was like, oh no, man. So yeah, there would be some times certainly, and I think even along with like Hereditary kind of mentioning on was the French extreme films that were coming out in like the mid 2000s. Some of that stuff that
Martyrs
was
and
coming, Martyrs. Yeah, you have,
High
um,
Tension and yeah,
yeah, yeah. Some
those
some of
were
those
yeah.
were
Or even like a Serbian film. You know, there were ones that are custom built. There's one called Baskin. I think it was out of Turkey a couple years ago. Like,
Have you seen
yeah,
that?
yeah, I did see it. Yeah, have you seen
Oh,
it?
dude, that movie
Yeah.
is awesome. That movie is so wild.
It's wild. I mean, you like it. You know, it does. It reminds me of not, but it had a little Clive Barker in it. You know what I mean? To me,
Sure.
anyways, a little bit of that sense of like, sex and death and that kind of weird interplay between eroticism and
Mhm,
torture. Which
mhm.
again, I think I was when I first came to Clive Barker, I was so young that I wasn't even fully aware of the themes he was really working with.
Yeah.
It was
What's
in the
happening
back of
here?
his head. Yeah, yeah, exactly. I mean, gross, okay, but I wasn't aware of the. I think to be honest, the more nuanced take of what he was working with gender and all sorts of really interesting stuff. But
Sure.
I don't think Baskin is quite trying to do that. But in any case, you're right. It was super wild and really well
Mhm.
shot and really like all the technical features of it were really, even the Serbian film. I was sort of shocked at just how
I
good it was for what a
I
great film it was.
that's one that I just can't bring myself to
Yeah,
start even, I think it was just
you're
one
not
of
into
those
anything.
it's one of those things where like earlier on, as a younger, I think that that would have been something just out of the envelope being pushed and being like, oh, but then
Yeah,
when people started initially kind of coming out and mentioning, the stuff with the children and everything, I was just like,
it's when
I'll
I think
pass.
some reviewers sort of said, well, it's really a breakdown of like the Serbian some part of their societal malfunction, or it's sort of making a political commentary. And I sort of thought, well, again, I don't know much about Serbians
Right.
political commentary, but I also feel like that maybe is a bit of a reach for what this film seems to be to me, which is, again, you mentioned like Guinea Pig or Faces of Death. It felt like the closest thing you want to come to, and that was the upsetting part of it, because some of the stuff I used to watch back in the 80s or whatever, it really looked like a group of mentally unstable people who had escaped from some facility and had been given a
Mhm.
film, but it
Yeah.
actually looked like not a good film. It looked like it was made for about $15. And you say, well, because there's no way anybody should have given this, idea money. But a Serbian film sadly was like that was a multi-million-dollar film, and somebody financed that film. You know what I mean? And even something like Martyrs
Never even
gets
knew that.
yeah, Martyrs. I mean, I don't know how much
Oh,
Martyrs cost, but it looked really good. And again, it was
yeah.
it was so bleak. You're right. It just made you feel so. And there's a certain point in your life where it's that kind of feeling is almost you almost welcome it at a weird point. But I
Mhm.
came to that much older, and I just felt really I want to go up and hug my kids. But
I mean,
maybe that's what the filmmaker would have loved. Like, had he been able
yeah,
to see that,
sure.
like exactly. I'm very happy that that's what I conjured in you.
And the director of Basket, his name's John Evernall. He has another movie called Housewife. If you get an opportunity to watch that,
Okay, yeah, a good
that
like
movie is
similar kind of
wild.
yeah.
Oh
Okay,
yeah, yeah,
I'll be there.
yeah.
I would totally watch that. You know what? Another one was like a Terrifier. Again,
Oh yeah.
sort of like, and again, I mean, yeah, I mean, it's worth a watch. It's for sure worth a watch.
Mhm.
But I almost feel when I watch movies like that, it's like I am indulging in my teenage self. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? I'm sort of letting that young ass person out of me to watch a movie for an hour and a half, and then I pack them away because I
Yeah.
would not, and I would, yeah, yeah. It's sort of like a, but I have friends of mine, and we'll watch anything. It's like really sort of like horror is one of those genres I feel like with film especially that it's like you don't begrudge watching an hour and 20 minutes of a film. You put it on. I don't know. I just feel like okay, it's not a great movie, but I'm not as upset at having watched it had it been say I don't know a comedy that was like deeply unfunny for an hour and a half. I would have been really upset about that. Whereas a horror film that's just kind of like doesn't quite hit the mark, I'm just for whatever reason I feel like I'm more forgiving about it. It's like, well, all right.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, so kind of touching on some of these moments here. three sequences, and we can even, if it's more difficult or less, we can
Okay.
even go through books or stories, or scenes in film that are just forever ingrained in your brain. Something that, upon that first time you viewed or you read, and you're like, God, I don't, how uncomfortable that put you, how disgusting it was, scary, your
Sure.
imagination with it. What comes to mind?
Um, you know, um, I would have said, and this is true, when we talked about The Ring, when whatever her name is, Serena, or whatever the demon is, comes out of the
Okay.
television, um, and then sort of flips over, and her body gets all arachnid. This was also in The Grudge, I think. And bodies kind of moving in a way that our bones shouldn't allow us to do that.
Right.
I found that pulverizingly scary. It's funny, Eric, because then I rewatched The Exorcist not long ago, and that Reagan O'Neill comes down her
Then the
own.
stairs.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm like, I completely forgot that scene. So it's like I felt that was completely unique to J horror, but
Uh-huh.
ultimately clearly it wasn't. It clearly was something that's been around, and whether they sort of had watched The Exorcist, which assumedly they might have, but in any
Yeah.
case, that sort of um, just watching that physically
Mhm.
got me. And in terms of like bleak endings, again, you talk about martyrs or whatever, but again, to go back to Pet Cemetery, there was the very end. It's I think I can probably remember word for word, like Rachel, who is Judd's wife. Not spoiler if anyone hasn't read the book or seen the movies.
Yeah.
Um, he buries her in the end, and the last scene is of her reappearance, and he's sitting at the table having a beer or something, and it's past the crack of midnight, and the door opens, and she shuffles towards him, and I think the term is like her voice was grating, comma, full of dirt. You know what I mean? Just and it ends on that, and I just thought that is not only horrifying, it leaves you wondering, well, where's this going to go? They're surely not, they're not going to make her breakfast and go about their lives,
Right.
but also just the bleakness of it, of like that was really instructional to me, of like a story that starts with all the best kind of intentions, with all the hope in the world, and through just incremental decisions and incremental weaknesses and accidents, and also the overall foreboding sense that the universe is not fair, and there's actually elements in the universe that are meant
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
to do you ill, and
Mhm.
not do you ill to do you ill in kind of a quizzical, like, the Sting about like the long con. It's not, they're not taking $20 from your pocket. They're going to take everything from you that they possibly can. That to me is like, there are many essences of horror, but that to me seemed like one of the most distilled and brutal kind of essences of horror, more so than obviously a Serbian film or Martyrs or anything like that. There's
Uh-huh.
just something more distilled about that, or even again Hereditary. Hereditary really bothered me, really, because it was the grandma who did this to her entire next of kin, basically. You know what I mean? Like that
Yeah.
she was that vicious that she would do that to her daughter, her grandson, her granddaughter. I'm trying to think. I guess one other thing I would say is, and I'd like to hear yours, Eric. After like at least one is, I remember reading the Hellbound Heart, which is what Hellraiser was based on,
Yes. Okay.
and the first couple, 20 pages are Frank opening the puzzle box, and then the Cenobites show up, who are, the Cenobites are like of, the iconic sort of villains, when they aren't really, in a weird way. They're kind of just doing their thing, and if you summon them, well, right? It's like you bugged us. But he goes through this thing where they actually make him feel sensations in a way like beyond anything human, like
Mhm.
where the idea of like the dripping of water, or the dust in trapped between the floorboards, can start to feel so psychically massive that
Mm.
it's painful,
Yeah. Yeah.
also perched on the verge of this erotic feeling as well. And I'd never my brain had never made that correlation. These two things could be linked in any kind of a way. And then at the very end, in the book, it's the in the movie it's Pinhead, but in the book it's a female Cenobite, and she's just naked sitting on the floor,
Mm-hmm.
and she's got like human tongues laid down her thighs, and she stands up, and the tongues fall off and hit the floor. And again, it was just that like, this is a naked, described as a beautiful woman who had ripped these denuded tongues on her legs, and she clearly had this kind of shocking power. Again, it was the very Barkerian sense of sex and eroticism and sadomasochism, basically, is what it was at some level.
Sure.
Intertwined, and it blew my mind. I don't even TMI here. It's not my kink. But I do find it, I absolutely find it, fascinating. And I found the way that he found an entryway into it. It was like peering through a keyhole into a place I never even knew could exist.
He seemed to have done that to anybody who was introduced to his work,
Yeah,
whether you wanted to be or not.
Oh, exactly. Yeah, but it's completely. I mean, I shouldn't say it's completely unique. I don't know. You know what I mean? George Bataille might be sort of a precursor. It's not like he was the only one who had done it, but he was the first that I ever came across. And to this day, after having gone down some whole rabbit holes with other writers and movies, I don't think nothing has affected me the way that Barker do that. I mean, yeah. Wow. So yeah, I don't know. What about you? I always find this fascinating.
You mentioned Pet Sematary, and I think from a transition from book to movie, when you see Zelda and you think of the description that they have, the physicality to her, the back, the spine, and then you see her in the movie, and it will never go away. No. I will never not be able to think of that.
It was Amanda Plummer too, the actor, who was Honey Bunny in Pulp Fiction, and other things as well. But she's got even a look to her. She's obviously very healthy, but that she really dove into that characterization.
Oh man!
And so I know
terrifying.
Exactly what you're saying. It was
terrifying. And and something more recently, we can move on from here. Have you seen Annihilation?
Yes. Yeah.
The bear?
And it was all like different kind of. The one I remember from that is they cut the guy open. He's got like things moving around inside of him. So the bear, do the bear again. Explain to me.
So there's the moment where, and God, I'm trying to think now how it ends up happening. Maybe it's something to do with they were like stuck in kind of like an in between of trying to go into that portal of like the like euphoric land. Yeah. And there's a bear that has like a person being like melted into it, like in together. And so you start hearing like it's the sounds more than anything, the like human groans to it. It's very unexpected and so very, very uneasy. That's like the main thing that I remembered from that movie. Is my wife and I like, oh my God, what is that?
I remember reading the book too, and really enjoyed. I mean, it's one of three really, but I read Annihilation, the first book in Vandermeer's that was based on, and again, there are some uncanny images in that book. Not the bear. I think that's Alex Garland's. And there's another scene in there where there's a guy kind of grafted to a wall. I think, kind of spread out, laid up against a wall. I feel like that's now The Last of Us actually has that too. In The Last of Us, it's fungus that is sort of moored a character or a victim to a wall. But man, I like Alex Garland. I mean, I like Alex Garland's stuff. I really liked Ex Machina.
Great.
I even like Men. I mean, Men is controversial. Some people are going to like it. But I really like creators, for lack of a better word, who really just like, well, this is what it is. I'm just going to throw it out there. We have a writer up here, a buddy of mine, Ian Reed, who did I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which Charlie Kaufman made into a movie and a book.
Oh yeah, okay.
Yeah, awesome writer. And Foe, which is good. His second book, which is also going to be coming.
Sure.
But again, you really respect these creatives who follow their own path. Are are thankfully encouraged in doing that, by their publishers, or in Alex Garland's case, by his producers and financial backers and studios. Because it's I think it's tough. I think it's tough probably to, um, especially in a movie sense, take all that money, and to do something that is maybe some of the focus groups would say, "Ooh, I don't know where you're going with this, my friend."
Sure.
And yet to still do it. So yeah. Anyways, yeah, I love that movie, as you said, and I do remember the band fusion. Now that you mention it,
Yeah, pretty uneasy for sure. Now, as far as so, and we're going to jump a little bit here. As far as you mentioned in an interview, age 12, right around there, taking a creative writing course, and in this course, what were some of these earlier stories or earlier things that you were wanting to piece together, and and creating a story of your own?
that is a both a great question and a question that my memory has betrayed me, and that you might be hearing my daughter down there somewhere.
It's
Um,
likewise.
she talk about a little horror. She's awesome. I love her, but man, she's a pepper pot. So I frankly cannot remember
Okay.
what those stories would have been about in grade 12. I knew they would have been horror influenced. I know that was my jam. I mean, and they probably were pretty derivative. I could imagine I probably did one where, like, you know, the serial killer stalks his victim and takes that victim home and prepares to do some sort of dastardly murder. Who's discovered that person is also a serial killer, and turns the tables, and that something like that. And I would have my 18-year-old self would have considered that a massive twist. But what mainly I remember back then, two things. First of all, that was unheard of at the time, that they would actually have a course like that.
Sure.
And so it was a teacher, and I went to a very, like, technically based high school. It was auto shop. We had a tech wing. Um, there was an arts type high school across the way, but we had moved there just in time to start high school, and I don't think my parents had really a chance to get the lay of the land.
Mm.
They got me into the closest high school to their catchment zone. Had they had more time, it might have been like, you know what, Craig might be better suited over here. But I really ended up in this high school that I loved, made a lot of great friends, but it wouldn't be considered, of all the high schools in the city, to be the one that was artistically inclined. So we just had this one really thoughtful teacher who took it upon herself to, of her own volition, to set up this creative writing course. And I've had the opportunity to sort of go back to my school, and she was still teaching there at the time, and say that, Miss Jeffries, like, you are one of the primary movers of my being a writer in the first place. And I said,
Wow.
20, 23, and 25, eating potatoes, and barely being able to rub two nickels together. I might have said, I wish she said I sucked so I could go have done something else. But I wouldn't. I think anyone who really wants to be a writer, or anything, they kind of just put up with whatever slings and arrows come your way. But I think it was meaningful to her to know that she had that influence on me, and it's well deserved. And I really, whatever the stories are, is lost to the mists of my memory. But her encouragement was the real fundamental part of that mattered, and that I carried with me.
I love and appreciate that, and I think for anybody that hears that and has children, and over the course of COVID, can have a complete different appreciation for teachers and for anybody in education, because going through, and people saying, especially in the United States, that teachers are overpaid, or they're da 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 this and this and that. I have a lot of teachers in my family, and I have had the course of my life to see what hell they go through. And I mean, you still having that appreciation and being able to, if you can go back and speak, to classes or anything, that's awesome. I love that just as much as hearing about the stories. It's great.
Yeah, we get that up here too. We got this, condemning the teachers, but especially, you're right. Whatever you felt about pre-pandemic, what they went through and what they struggled with and the sort of the situation that they found themselves in. Again,
Hmm.
we've been fortunate in our teachers, and obviously you have some in your family who their students are fortunate to have them too. So you're right. Whatever the thoughts of beforehand, I think going through the pandemic, you can't help but rehabilitate your beliefs about teachers in general. If you held dim views of them in the first place.
Sure. Yeah. No, absolutely. From this earlier memory, we kind of get into. I wanted to touch on more recent books of yours, being in the Troop and then Cascade. I was rewriting, I was deleting things out because I'm like, this is going to get into 3 or 4 hours, and I'm not going to take up your whole Sunday here.
No, it's
I
fine.
have
It's a good talk. I appreciate it.
Okay, awesome, awesome. So initially with the Troop, just as an idea of sitting down and the initial notes that you have with working on this, what were the initial kind of pieces as far as putting this together and how you wanted to navigate the vary of different characters and scenarios that are happening in this book?
Yeah, well, there's some pieces to that. So I think the first thing that I discovered is the book that I wrote before the Troop. First of all, before the Troop, I'd
Okay.
never written any. I'd written, maybe some stories that would have had elements of horror in them, but I'd never. I mean, but obviously we discussed like I was a huge horror fan and lover, and I always thought that I wanted to write a horror book at some point in my career. But when mainly as I went to school, I went to did a master's in English and creative writing, and at
Oh,
that
okay.
point, and I hope this has changed, and I suspect it has. But if I'd gone to an East Coast university and if I wasn't writing Canadian fiction, whatever that was, and that would be narrowly defined under the notion of like literary Canadian fiction that you could actually base a thesis on. So if I had gone and said, I want to write, this story about boys on an island who are getting devoured by a mutant tapeworm, that would have my thesis advisor would have took issue with that. So so it kind of forced me. I wouldn't say forced because I liked what the story. I also like literary, fiction, whatever that means, right? So I wrote a collection of short stories that were my thesis. That a couple years later ended up becoming my first published book under my own name, anyways, Rust and Bone.
Rust and Bone. Okay.
So that kind of set me down this path of writing that kind of fiction, and so I'd done that, and then the last book I wrote under my own name up until the Troop was called Cataract City, and it starts off with two young boys who get lost in the woods, are kind of taken there by a wrestler, their idol, and he dies out in the woods, and they have to find their way out. So I discovered that I liked writing from that place of boyhood, and maybe especially from boyhood, childhood, where you were put in a position where suddenly you have to sort of do adult things. You have to
Hmm.
like take on way more responsibility than you should really have to at that
Have
age.
to. Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then so having written that, and then me and my wife went to a museum, and they were doing a special exhibition on water, and you can probably see where this is going. How we use water in the world in different places, different utilities. And there was this darkened antechamber where they were playing a video of tapeworms, and I was fascinated. Any dark antechamber, I will drift towards naturally. My wife is just like, oh, yeah, there he goes. The dark antechamber. Of course, I know my husband's going. So I saw that. I had come off, still kind of riding this high feeling of really enjoying that section, especially of my previous book. And these two things, I'm sorry, I'm just going to turn this
Not a problem.
off. They came together, and so there it was. We had the beginnings of the Troop, and I had gone to Boy Scouts as a kid, had enjoyed it. Quite a bit actually, but realized that it's dying. Just like, kids going to the library. I don't know how it is in the States, but up here in Canada, Boy Scouts is kind of nerdy for whatever reason, but I certainly enjoyed it. So a lot of it came from my own sort of history and background. And then the rest of it, I mean, a lot of that is the Apocrypha. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't, I wanted to do these kind of like interstitials where you're having the action that's happening in the main part of the book on the island where the boys are battling each other in some ways, but also this threat. And you wanted to have stuff that happened later that kind of explains it. And I had read Carrie, and I thought Carrie had the great way of doing that. You know, you
Mm.
had happened during the course of the actual narrative, and then you had years later some of the survivors of that commenting and just sort of newspaper article, sort of fake PhD papers and stuff, you know, academic papers. So I thought, oh, this is great. You know, I will use that kind of chassis and tell my story using those kind of interstitials the same way King did with Carrie. So that was the sort of the plan there. But I remember, and I did write it. I wrote it like furiously. I probably finished that, Eric, in like 4 to 6 weeks. Like it just came out of me quicker
Oh,
than
wow.
yeah. And I think you'll hear writers say that. You know, every so often a book. No, book, you know, there's this idea that, well, if it's any type of a good book, you've got to like throw yourself around the room for 4 or 5 years, and you know,
Mhm.
it's like sometimes, you know, if you're Donna Tartt and every 10 years you slobber knocker and it's awesome, yeah. But a lot of us, you know, that's not the way it is. So, but I remember sending it to my agent, who to that point had no idea I even had this affinity for that type of writing, and he had supported me through my more literary efforts, thinking that he was going to say, "This is where the road narrows between us," you know.
Yeah,
And
sure.
yeah. But no, he was actually said, "I like this. I really like this, and I think we can do something about it." But I don't have the contacts in that sphere, so he had to take some time to like find the right editors who he would send it to, and he did, and we got very fortunate and sold it, and I'm still with that same editor now. So it's been great. I mean, the entire like opportunity really to write, I don't know, a companion stream to what the fiction I was writing up until that point has been hugely validating, and maybe more importantly, it's been validating because it has been my first love. You know what I mean? It's not like, I think one of the things I always worry about, Eric, is that people, especially because I use a pen name, is that I am doing it as like some kind of cynical effort to, you know, I don't harness a market or something. You know what I mean? It's like that's not,
Oh, okay.
it never is. You know, I don't think any book, any creative effort would probably even be worth doing if you were just doing it as kind of a cynical cash grab. Which I'm not saying those haven't been done, but no, for me, it's a genuine love of the genre, and a love letter back to it in a way. You know what I mean? Or at least giving myself an opportunity, thankfully, to contribute to the genre that I grew up loving.
There is absolutely a spirit in what it is, and not to say, you know, as far as with, you know, stuff under your name, you have, you know, a couple of different names here as far as you know, ways of presenting your work. But as far as you know, you have Nick Cutter and you have the stuff that you've put out. There is certainly like a glowing light in the background with a Batman sign that's like, yeah, I'm here, and this is my full energy that I'm having a good time doing this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it too. I really do enjoy, you know, my wife will sometimes come up and find me cackling like a maniac. And you must be going good, you know what I mean? Or sometimes I get, I get rather overwhelmed, like emotionally sometimes as well. So I
Okay.
mean, those are usually the signposts to me, the emotive signposts that tell me that I'm on the right track, hopefully. And but I guess that also says that, you know, these things do affect me emotionally in a way that I guess if I was less committed or less enthused, she'd find like essentially a mannequin up here typing or something.
Sure.
Not that way. There's a lot of energy coming out of the writing room.
So okay, so as far as, you know, we kind of touched on earlier with particular scenes and particular things that, you know, even the story that you had of the cactus people, where, you know, everybody's kind of tossing around, hey, have you heard of this, and have you, when I'm initially introduced to the troop, the thing that I'm pulling up online and kind of, you know, like my prep in before, you know, like getting the book and reading and partially listening to it so I could finish before the interview here, was the sea turtle incident and the incident within this. And once getting to it, I was like, boy, I understand what they're saying. I see what's happening here. um, as far as writing something in this vein and then editing, and what was there a lot that, from what you initially had written and the descriptive and the, you know, just how do I texture with it? Was there a lot that was stripped away from that, or did that end up being, pretty much from what you're initially writing was what we ended up getting in the finalized version?
Again, miss of memory, but I would say that probably what happens is I used to, I would have written that back in like I think it came out in 2014, so I was probably writing it back in 2013, even maybe late 2012. So I actually was writing it back then on a tower, with the monitor, like an
Oh,
old
okay.
style, computer. But on the side of the monitor, I took a Sharpie and I'd written the five senses, and that was my reminder, especially during the editing phase. If I felt like a scene was working but could work better, go back. Most of my scenes are written in, they're through a character's eyes. So go back and impress upon the five senses. If there's something there that they could have tasted, if there's
Oof.
something they could have smelled or tactilely sort of had some kind of, and that often I work my way through, comb my way through an edit with that in mind of if the first draft is kind of a skeleton of that scene, it's got all the bones, but it's missing some of the flesh. That would be the time during ensuing edits. And I have a really good editor who is very fastidious about those types of things as well. So I would imagine, not completely remembering it, but that scene and a few other scenes in the troupe probably got more visually, tactilely, sort of like sensorily embiggened during the editorial process, for sure.
Oh, okay.
So,
Okay.
but a lot of a lot of it was, and I know that scene, and there's probably a couple others,
Yeah.
and it wasn't that I was, in retrospect, you're like, obviously anybody who would read that would at least a good number of readers would have the reaction you had, or seems to be the general reaction to that scene, and it was strange because I wasn't trying to necessarily be inflammatory. I mean, I think, trying to say something that, these boys were, well, that was kind of their shift into, one of their shifts anyways, into savagery, but it was not even purposeful. They were hungry, but more than they were hungry, they were just scared.
Yeah.
And when people are scared, the boundaries have a bad way of loosening, and the devils get in. And so, I hope I conveyed the fact that they were deeply guilty about it after they'd done it, and did their best, sort of in what I hope to be the cathartic next scene where they help the babies, sort of get into the ocean. Anyways, it's funny, the things that you write that you think are gonna not provoke any kind of concern. Like, I'll tell you, when and I think my editor might have, not my editor, but my agent might have felt this way too. It's like, dude, we're killing kids. You're killing kids.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, that's okay.
Yeah.
It's like,
The animals.
hey, it's a turtle. And I'm like, I know, I don't like that either, but I would have thought that the sticking point would have been with readers or
Kids.
So,
Well, and the thing is,
yeah.
I wasn't trying to interrupt. I apologize. I was just going to mention, the thing is where, and with it being as extreme as it is, or not even say extreme, but just with it, the envelope being pushed in that, line that you've kind of mentioned as far as tiptoeing and, not quite jumping over the edge, but having that moment where you're just quivering in your
I might
skin.
have lost you.
Uh-oh. You still see me? Do you still see me or no? Let's see here. Do I have you?
Well, gang.
Let's see here.
Lovely. Might come back, but
let's try to save this really quick.
Turn this off. It's been a slice.